On a dark, warm night in May of 1914, a fog rose up from the St. Lawrence River in Canada to swallow up the two ships sailing its waters. Minutes later, the two would collide in a screech of metal that signaled impending tragedy. One ship would stay afloat and make its way back to port safely, newly laden with the living and dead alike. The other would sink, taking over 1,000 souls down with it. It would become the worst peacetime maritime disaster in Canadian history. Before that morning, however, that ship was merely the Royal Mail ship Empress of Ireland, the Canadian ocean liner that transported thousands to new worlds. I'm not here for the grand schemes, and now neither are you. Long history, very short, this is Little Slights, and in this week's episode we'll be discussing not a person, but an event lost to the shadows cast by history's limelight. Let's talk about the Canadian Titanic. 1:47 a.m., just 9 minutes after the first sighting. Later, the first mate of the Storstad would swear that the last thing they saw of the Empress of Ireland was its big red navigational light that set on her port or left side, meaning that the Storstad thought that the Empress of Ireland was still close to the southern shore. They assumed the ship was merely passing them on its original course, port to port. They had not realized the ship had turned, and so the Storstad went forward in a slow starboard or right turn. Through the night came 3 sharp, loud whistles. Captain Kendall, unnerved and uncertain due to the sudden fog, was ordering his engines full astern, which meant that essentially the Empress slowed to a snail's pace in the water. Kendall decided to keep to his course and wait for a sign that the other ship had passed. Then he would go forward. Instead, he saw something much worse. Off their starboard side, the on-duty, on-deck crew of Empress of Ireland saw 2 lights appear through the gloom. It was the Storstad, bearing down on them with no chance of avoiding a collision. Kendall immediately ordered a sharp turn to starboard, hoping to swing the ship far right enough through the water that Empress would only receive a glancing blow, but it was far too late. The ships collided. There are conflicting reports as to how fast the Storstad was going when it struck, but speed might not have even mattered due to the shape of the bow and how heavy the Storstad was. It was lugging 10,000 tons of coal. Author James Kroll would write in his book 14 Minutes that the Storstad's bow had gone through the liner's steel ribs as smoothly as an assassin's knife. It had torn a hole 350 square feet into the hull of the liner. A significant portion of that was underwater. Water poured in 60 gallons a second, causing the ship to lift starboard almost immediately. Making matters worse over time was that many passengers and crew had left the portholes open to enjoy the nice, peaceful night air on the St. Lawrence River. As the ship tipped further, more water would continue to pour in through the portholes, causing a further list, and so on. The watertight bulkhead doors meant to keep the ship afloat even if 2 of her 11 compartments had been exposed to the sea were no use in the face of the onslaught. They had been built to be manually operated and never updated for automatic use. Chief Engineer William Sampson gave the order to shut the doors, but on the starboard side at least, a good number of them were already halfway underwater. Sampson phoned the bridge, advising Captain Kendall to beach the ship to save it. Do the best you can, Kendall told him regarding the engines, and the engine room crew did for as long as they were able. Meanwhile, Kendall ordered all hands to be alerted, lifeboats to be prepared, and he sent an SOS call. The collision was significant enough to jolt most passengers and crew awake. Chief Steward Augustus Gade ordered his crew to wake the passengers that were still abed, get their life jackets on, and send them to the deck, where they would soon be launching lifeboats. Sadly, for a lot of passengers and crew on the lower starboard decks, mainly the 3rd class and some of the 2nd, it was too late. The water was coming in too fast. Later, survivors and historians would console themselves with saying that at least their drowning was quick. What crew could help had to prioritize, and that meant facing the harsh truth that it was those passengers on the upper decks that were most likely to survive, and those passengers that had to be focused on. They still tried to save as many as they could, some of them going door to door to wake anybody who was still asleep. Two of those awakened by a crew member were Michael and Patrick McAlevey, greaser and scullion of the Empress respectively. The cousins made it. The crew member who saved them did not. Perhaps that brave crew member had been Harold Jones, bedroom steward who was last seen by a fellow crew member going below deck to help more passengers to the lifeboats. He was never seen again. Or maybe it was seaman Thomas Corrigan, who would later die saving the young man who had been his onboard neighbor on Empress of Ireland since Liverpool. There was no shortage of heroic acts amongst the crew members trying to get all the people they could to the deck. 6 minutes in, and Empress of Ireland had completely lost power, plunging the ship into darkness. Of the 16 metal lifeboats, only 5 had been successfully launched, with the 6th capsizing as it was lowered. This was in part because the portside deck of the ship was now so high in the air its lifeboats could not be launched at all. Below deck, hundreds still scrambled to escape the rapidly rising water and make it above. One of those desperate souls was Stanley Baker, a bellboy on the ship, leading his older brother Thomas to safety, when, unfortunately, a door was sealed shut between them. Trapped on either side of the door, Thomas begged his younger brother to keep going and leave him behind. Reluctantly, Stanley did, and he survived. Thomas did not. The ship now completely out of power, Chief Engineer Sampson rounded his crew together and made his way to the deck. Most of his men would survive, later being fished out of the water by a lifeboat manned by the ship's butcher. But there was at least one, a William Clark, who had survived the sinking of the Titanic as well, who could not recall how he got on the lifeboat at all. Meanwhile, Augustus Gade made his way to the bridge, where Captain Kendall still stood, intending, as all captains do in these situations, to go down with his ship. Could the Empress be beached, he asked, and Kendall replied no. The engines were dead. Well, this looks to be about the finish, Gade said. Yes, and a terrible finish it is, too, Kendall agreed. Not long after, the Empress gave a sudden, horrifying lurch sideways. Kendall and the others were thrown from the bridge and into the water. Those out on the deck, meanwhile, those suddenly faced with the encroaching water, began instead to climb. Across the wooden planks, up through the portholes, they climbed to the port side as the water crept up the deck. One of those climbers was Grace Hannigan, who had just recently turned 7. She was on the Empress with her family to go to the 3rd International Salvation Army Congress. Her father, who was a member of the band, had just conducted the orchestra on the ship the previous afternoon, and the Hannigan family was looking forward to a lovely trip on the ship, followed by an even lovelier holiday once the Congress was over. Now, Grace was clinging to her parents as they made their way atop the railing and waited with the other families. Her parents told her not to be scared as the water drew closer. Grace had been frightened when she got on the ship, you see, unwilling to sleep close to a porthole because she believed that was where the water would come in. She and nearly 700 passengers sat and waited and told themselves not to be scared. And for just a brief minute or two, it seemed the ship had ceased sinking. Perhaps some of them probably thought the captain had managed to run the ship aground after all, and they could stay there until rescue came. Then, at 2:10 a.m., the bow of Empress of Ireland rose out of the water and the ship began its final slide. It had sunk in just 14 minutes. Hundreds were tossed into the frigid waters of the St. Lawrence River. The 5 lifeboats, as well as the Storstad, were still nearby and began pulling as many people as they could out of the water, but between the noise, the lack of light, and general panic, there was only so much they could do. Survivor Alice Bales would later recall going into the water in vivid detail, though she could not remember the actual sinking. Quote, "I was getting away from the swarm of people who were around the ship when a big man, wounded in the head, approached and clung to me. I was trying to shake him off, for he was pulling me down, when I saw his head fall forward. I knew he was dead. He drifted away and disappeared. I do not know who it was horrible. I was drifting away myself. When the boat sank, the suction took me down. I involuntarily began to paddle with my feet and came to the surface. Then I saw a man swimming. It was then quite light. I watched him, and though I cannot swim a stroke, I imitated his arm motions and found I got along a little. I was picked up. Augustus Gade, thrown earlier from the bridge, was unable to swim and only survived by clinging to a body still wearing its life jacket until rescue came via collapsible lifeboat. The morbidity of using a corpse to survive notwithstanding, he fared better than Patrick Heron, a cook, who went into the water and had to stay afloat for 7 hours before being rescued. Little Grace Hannigan hit the water and went under twice until she found a bit of wreckage to hold on to, but she had lost her parents in the chaos and could not see them anywhere. What she did see was one of the lifeboats nearby, and she called for help until they came for her, whereupon she lost consciousness. She woke up on the Storstad. Her first question, "Where is my mother?" No one had an answer. Perhaps one of the worst of these stories was that of actor and first-class passenger Lawrence Irving. He'd made it to a lifeboat, made it to safety. But when he turned and realized that his wife Mabel wasn't with him, Mabel, who couldn't swim, he immediately went back into the water to search for her. They were never seen again, and their bodies never recovered. The Storstad had become the obvious place to put the survivors until additional help could arrive. Captain Kindle, who had been pulled from the river by Lifeboat 3, directed rescue operations from there. He would fill his lifeboat up with survivors, tow them to the nearby Storstad, drop them off, and row out again. Over the next few hours, the Storstad and 2 government steamers, the Eureka and the Lady Evelyn, would pick survivors and bodies out of the water. After 2 hours, however, the hope for actual survivors was slim, as anybody left in the water had likely either drowned or succumbed to hypothermia. Exhausted, Kindle allowed himself to finally be brought aboard the Storstad, where he confronted the skipper and told the man he had sunk Kindle's ship. His anger, though, was a drop in the ocean compared to the misery, suffering, and grief surrounding him. Lawrence Irving, his wife Mabel Hackney, Henry Seton Carr, Harold Jones, Baker, nearly the entirety of the Salvation Army band, all were gone. 1,012 people were gone. 840 passengers and 172 crew. Of those lost were 437 men, 269 women, and 134 children. Grace Hannigan, the little girl now ensconced in blankets and asking for her parents, was the youngest survivor and one of only 4 children to make it off the Empress alive. Out of the 65 boys on board, only 1 had lived. 1. As for the Empress herself, she was currently settling herself 130 feet deep on the river's bed, so shallow that you could see its mast and funnels through the water if you looked closely. It's unknown how many bodies were still trapped within her hull. The survivors were taken from the Storstad, Eureka, and Lady Evelyn to the city of Rimouski. Several would die there of pneumonia. Those that were deemed well enough to travel were sent to Toronto. Along with the living went the recovered bodies, set up in the Toronto mortuary for identification. It was there in that cold room that Grace Hannigan was shown her father's body. He had drowned in the river after they had lost sight of each other. Her mother was never found. There was, of course, an inquiry into the disaster, though it was ultimately inconclusive. The stories of each captain, that being Henry Kindle and the Storstad's Captain Anderson, were just too different and conflicting. Both maintained that they had chosen a course and stuck to it, and there was no decisive evidence that either was lying. Like with most disasters, it was a train wreck of factors. Kindle's decision to change course, the Storstad's assumption of what side the Empress of Ireland they were on, Storstad's decision to change course, the fog, the slowing of the engine, the shape and make of the Storstad's bow, the rapidity of the sinking, and the manually operated watertight doors. All of it combined into a horrible miasma of bad luck and tragedy. The commission ultimately decided that the blame should fall on whoever changed her course during the fog, and therefore it was the Storstad's fault for altering her course to starboard. The Norwegian authorities who investigated the wreck blamed Captain Kindle for trying to pass starboard to starboard, which was against protocol. In the end, Captain Kindle and the CPR won, if there was any winning to be had. Henry Kindle would go on to work on several more ships, including one voyage where he saved 600 refugees on his old friend the Montrose, and even surviving his ship being torpedoed in World War I. The company itself would win a $2 million lawsuit against the owners of the Storstad, and seize the Storstad itself to sell. For my part, I can't help but agree with the conclusions drawn by both inquiries. But no one could anticipate the fog. No one could anticipate what was going to happen at all. In the heat of the moment, decisions are made, and only afterwards are they seen for the mistakes they might be. For the survivors, life likely moved on quickly. World War I was just around the corner, and the space for grief and trauma became vanishingly small in the upcoming years. Many of the survivors of the crew went right back out to sea. Besides Henry Kendall, Augustus Gade would go on to serve on the Melita and Empress of Scotland, eventually becoming CPS's shore steward in Liverpool. Stanley Baker became a second officer and married in 1924. Patrick Heron, the cook who had been in the water for 7 hours, continued working on ships but reportedly never recovered from the sinking. He died in the mid-1920s. As for little Grace Hannigan, she was sent to live with her uncle. A year after the disaster, she finally accepted that her mother was never coming back. She started working for the Salvation Army like her parents as an adult, and she soon got married. Every year on the anniversary of the sinking, she traveled with other Salvation Army survivors to the monument that had been established in the cemetery in Toronto. Its inscription reads, "In sacred memory of 167 officers and soldiers of the Salvation Army promoted to glory from the Empress of Ireland at daybreak, Friday, May 29th, 1914. It's just one monument of several, including the one that serves as a headstone for the mass grave which stands on a coastal road near the site of the sinking. There is another in the Rimouski Cemetery, and the CPR erected its own monuments in Quebec. Empress of Ireland was the worst maritime disaster in Canada in peacetime. But those last two words are key when looking at its impact in history. The year was 1914. World War I was bearing down on Europe and stretching its fingers into North America, and the tragedy of the Empress's sinking would be lost to bigger, bolder, and somehow even more terrifying headlines. Caught between the Titanic, the Lusitania, and the sinking of ships and losses of hundreds that would seem to become near routine during the war, including, even more personally to Canada, the horrifying events of the wreck of the Mont Blanc and subsequent Halifax explosion that killed nearly 2,000 people, Empress of Ireland became a footnote in a decade defined by death. With that said, the Empress has never been forgotten, especially not in Canada, and outside of that has left a lasting impact on naval design. The investigation into the disaster led designers to change the way bows were built, from the reverse slanting that was common at the time, the kind that the Storstad had, which punched through the Empress's hull, to a raked bow, prow forward, that can minimize the force of collisions under the water, hopefully preventing the massive damage and rapid sinking that ships couldn't hope to prevent or mitigate when they happened. In popular culture, the event has been commemorated on stamps and in museum exhibitions throughout Canadian history, particularly at the 100th anniversary in 2014. The Canadian Museum of History called Empress of Ireland Canada's Titanic, and the Maritime Museum in Pointe-à-Pierre, which is near the sinking, has almost 200 pieces from the ship on exhibit. Quebec in particular has taken actions to declare the wreckage of Empress of Ireland a site of historical and archaeological importance, and a historic site of Canada, the first underwater site to be declared such in the territory. The wreck is now a protected site, though it can be visited by experienced divers. So if ever you sail down the St. Lawrence River, keep a lookout for a white buoy bobbing quietly on the water near Pointe-à-Pierre. There lies the wreckage of the RMS Empress of Ireland. Her hull, her masts, her funnels, her beds and chairs and fine china, luggage and keepsakes and treasures. But remember not just that 96th fatal voyage, but also the 95 that came before. 187,000 passengers, immigrants and entrepreneurs, dreamers and visionaries, 1,000 hopes and ambitions, served in 6 days or less on the Empress of Ireland.